Hey, it's Jack DiLaura from the future here to wrap up part 2 of our Refik Anadol particles tutorial, which ran a little bit long for a single video. In this one, we're going to focus on finishing up our instancing setup with some colors and some alpha fade in and scaling out when our particles are nearing the end of their life. And then we will finish up with some post effects, including a super simple but effective kind of pseudo depth of field effect with the depth top. So with that, I'm going to pass the baton back to past me to finish up this tutorial. One thing to point out as we're moving right along here is that if you notice any stuck particles, as we can kind of see one right here, at any point, go ahead and hit the reset pulse button in the particle SOP. Again, as I was mentioning before, a lot of times as we're modifying the parameters within the particle SOP or any of the operators that are connected to it, we can end up with these situations where particles get stuck, and resetting is the way to correct for that. So if we take a look at our output right now, we have a bunch of boxes which are moving around in a interesting turbulent fashion. And they are all gray at the moment. They have a little bit of shading applied to them. The other thing that might be harder to notice at the moment is that when they are spawned and when they die, they will just sort of pop on and off. So we can use a couple of different things to correct for that or make that transition less apparent. Which we're going to approach via working with the opacity of each one of our instances and the scale of that instance, both based on how long that particle has existed for. So let's dive right into that part of the network. So if you've never worked with particles before, this is all probably new to you, but as you've seen already with that sort of rotation vector that we set up, there's a lot more to be gained or information that can be grabbed from the particles that we're generating than just simply the point position itself. And there's even more that we can grab, which we will work on now, which includes how long the particle is in its life or lifespan. So to access that information, we can right-click on the output of our null instance position operator, head to the chop page, and grab a SOP to chop. Now, by default, this is just going to take all of the point positions that we have within this SOP and give those to us in the form of chop channels, which we don't actually need for this particular situation. So we can turn that switch here, position XYZ, off at the top. Then we can come down to the custom switch, which we're going to then turn on. This allows us to grab attributes, components of our SOP that are not one of these kind of default commonly used options above. So in our case, if we enter in the attribute scope here, life, and hit enter, we get the output here of the current lifespan or current point in their lifespan of each one of the particles that we're generating. The second channel that we have below is the setting for the lifespan found within the particle SOP. So we really only need this first channel, and so we're going to go ahead and grab that. Another component, actually, now that I think about it, that we're going to need is Z positioning for our coloring that we're going to do later on. So I am going to go ahead and turn that position XYZ switch back on for now. But we're going to first begin by focusing on the life 0 channel. So as you might expect, we need to isolate that channel. So I'm going to grab a select chop and move that over to the right. I'm going to grab the life 0 channel in that channel names parameter, And then I'm going to rename it to simply life because we don't have, additional life channels that we're going to be working with. So the first thing that I'm going to do here is to attach a math chop. We're going to use this channel now to control the alpha, the amount of transparency of each one of our instances. So here I'm going to use the math chop to change the range of this data so that it will give us values that are appropriate for alpha, which falls between 0 and 1. So in our range page here, I'm going to change this from range minimum parameter, or the first parameter here, to correspond to the on the particle, within the particle SOP, the life expectancy parameter. The reason that I'm going to do that is because the maximum value in our chop channel here will never exceed 25 because of this parameter setting. And if we ever change that parameter, we don't want to have to come into our math chop and modify the range. So this parameter's name is life, so we can write an expression here in our from range parameter that will allow us to access that parameter. So if I go ahead and click on the from range parameter in the second component here, from range 2, we're going to type in our expression. So op, open and close parentheses, single quotes, particle 1, we'll grab the particle 1 SOP. Then we want to grab a parameter from that SOP, so dot par, and then the parameter's name is life, so dot life. If we hit enter, we should receive a value of 25. So that will take care of our from range, which again is starting at 0 when the particle is first generated and reaching a maximum of 25 when it dies. So for the to range, we're going to do something a little bit different than you might expect. Instead of just leaving it in 0 to 1, which is kind of the expected alpha value range, we're going to modify this a bit because we want to make sure that these particles will fade in from 0 in a shorter amount of time so that basically they're not transparent for most of their life and only reach this kind of value of 1 as they are dying. So what I'm going to do here is set the to range, the initial point here, to negative 0.2. That will ensure that when the particles are first generated, there is no kind of situation where they have some opacity already and we kind of see that pop where they turn on. In the to range second parameter here, I'm going to set the maximum to 5. And again, the whole point of this is to just ensure that the particle's opacity, the box in our final render's opacity, will reach that value of 1 where it's fully, it's no longer transparent at all, much sooner than the end of its life, and we don't have a bunch of transparent particles overlapping one another. So from there, I'm going to attach a null. We're going to call this null alpha, and we're not even going to use it yet. We still have some additional stuff that we need to do with this operator. So one other thing that we can use this same set of data for is to modify the scale of our operator or our boxes over time. So the way that we're going to approach having these boxes disappear in a more elegant way is to decrease the scale of them over time until they disappear. Instead of working with the alpha channel that we have here. It'll give us a little bit of variance in the sizing as well, which will add a nice aesthetic change to our output. So for that component, I'm going to middle mouse click on the output of the select, grab a second math chop, which I'll put above. And here, all we need to do is make that same chop reference from our particle SOP. So I'm just actually going to go ahead and copy this expression from our math chop here, head back to our new math chop. And in this case, I want the again, I want it in the from range upper parameter here. I'm just going to paste that in and hit enter. We should see 0 to 25. And then here, I actually want to reverse the output so that as the particle gets older, the scale gets smaller. So for the 2 range, I'm going to flip this to read 1 and then 0. So again, as they get older, they will slowly decrease in scale until they disappear completely. Then I'll attach a null to the right and rename this to null scale. Now this one we can directly connect to our instancing setup and see the effects immediately. So I'm going to click on the geo, head to the first instance page, drag in the scale, null scale to the scale operator, grab life for scale X, Y, and Z. And then what we should see, it might be a little bit hard as they're all the same color at the moment, is that we have some operator or some boxes rather that are smaller than the others, and we shouldn't have a situation where we see them kind of pop off as they disappear. This is, again, probably super subtle at the moment because everything is gray. So that's all good. Let's continue on with the coloration section of our instancing setup. So the way that we're going to apply color to our instances today is to use the Z position value of that particular instance. That way, depending on how far away the instances are from the camera, we can choose what color we want to apply in that range. So, as you might expect, we need another select chop. Here, we're going to connect that to the SOP2, and then we're going to grab the channel name TZ. So that is our Z position value. And here, we're just going to attach a math chop and head to the range page here, set our from range from -5 to +5 so that our values are then rearranged to 0 to 1. And then I'll add a null to the end here. And this is our null, I guess it's more of a normalized TZ, but that's okay. So we have now a Z position to select and apply color, and an alpha channel, which we can use to control the alpha of our colors that are being applied. So what do we need to do? We need to take these and convert them into top textures, and then eventually apply those to our instancing setup. So I'm going to right click on the output of each one of these and add a chop to operator. For our first one here, we're just going to leave it as it is. For the second one, we're going to actually also leave it as it is. From there, we now have 2 textures that correspond to these chop channels, and we're going to combine them together in such a way that will be useful for adding color to our instances. So first of all, I'm going to add a ramp chop, or a ramp top rather. This is going to be used to apply color to the instances that we have on screen. So the way that we're going to approach this is to add a couple different colors into the ramp so that we have like different ranges of distance that will have different colors applied to them. Again, this will probably make more sense once we have this all connected, and you can then kind of come back and modify your settings here accordingly. So what I did for the example at the beginning was to set a blue color on the very left of this ramp, which I want to make sure I select the correct color keyframe first. So we've got a nice blue. Then somewhere around the middle, I added a second blue color keyframe. You can do that again by clicking in this gradient. And then I added another one to the right of that, which I'll have to click over here, which I set to a green value. something approximately in that range. And then I put another one after that in the kind of light purple range. Let's see if I can get something close enough to that. Yeah, it's kind of a bluish purple. And then I added another white keyframe over here. Again, I kind of did this by eyeballing what I thought looked good in the final outcome. Feel free to adjust this as you want to once you've got this connected and kind of see what the results look like. So what we can do is use a lookup top, which we can then connect the chop to the first input and the ramp to the second input. So our lookup top will essentially allow us to take the color information from the second image and almost remap the values in our chop to these colors. Right now, you might have noticed that it is still outputting essentially the same texture that we have in our first input, and that actually has to do with the particular color mode that it is set to. Right now it's set to a 32-bit float mono texture, meaning that it's monochrome black and white. If we head to the common page and set this instead to something like a 32-bit float, we should then see that the information here now has some color applied to it. One last thing that we're going to do before we take this color and apply it to our instances is to use the information from this chop, which remember is the alpha channel that we've set up, to control the alpha of this image. So we can do that very simply via the reorder top. So I'm going to connect the lookup to the first input here, and then I'm going to connect the alpha to the second input. All we need to do then is to flip our alpha, or output alpha rather, to input 2, and then I want to grab the luminance from that particular channel. Once we've done that, we now have the final texture for applying color to these instances. So I'm just going to rename that to null color. You could probably do null instance color to kind of follow this from before, but that's okay. Now let's head back to the geo. And on the instance 2 page, we can scroll down to this color section, drag in null color for the color operator, and we want to make sure to grab the RGB and alpha channels to make this function as we intend it to. So now if we take a look at our output, we have some nice colorful instances appearing on screen. We've taken care of the situations where the particles are born and where they die. And so we have done a great job of refining this, but all that is left now for us to do is to add a couple of post effects. So getting started in that direction, the first thing that I'm going to do is to modify the resolution of this render top. The initial version of this effect we saw at the beginning of the video was in a square 1:1 aspect ratio, and so that's what I'm going to set my resolution here to right now. So I'm going to pull up this drop down and pick 1024 by 1024, which gives us that square aspect ratio and shows us a little bit more of our scene in the vertical direction, which is great. I'm then going to auto fit the tops there to size, and we can continue on. So I'm going to shift all of this stuff down a little bit because we're going to add a couple of operators here. The next thing that we're going to work on is adding a depth of field effect. So the way that we can approach this in TouchDesigner is to grab a depth top, which can generate a depth image from a render. So if I drag the render top onto the depth top, it sets the operator parameter automatically, and you can see that we now have a black and white depth image coming out of our depth top here. Now, this is pretty low contrast because of the kind of range of these objects from our camera and the way that it's being scaled via this operator. So we're going to modify it a little bit. So we're going to change from this depth texture pixel format to something like 8-bit fixed. we're going to use a monochrome texture because we're only dealing with grayscale coming out of this operator anyway. And then I'm going to modify this depth space parameter to rearranged from camera space. Now, as soon as we do that, it changes the range that it's interpolating from to something much greater than what it was set to before, or rather it kind of scales it to something smaller than it was before. So we end up with all of our boxes on screen being black and the background being white, which, isn't super useful because we don't really get any of that range of depth from the camera. So that has to do with our range from parameter that we are starting with. So it kind of takes that parameter and then normalizes it to whatever range we want in this output. And our kind of far distance here, this 1000, is set much too high for, at least for this particular example. So if I set that to something like 4, you can see that we then get a much more kind of useful, but also we have a much larger range of values coming out of this. Our boxes that are closer to the camera are darker, and the ones that are further away kind of become lighter and lighter until they are white and can't be seen anymore. So what can we use this for? We can take this and work with a Luma blur to apply blur only to the boxes that we see on screen here that are dark or within a certain range based on our settings. So let's go ahead and add the Luma blur now. And then we'll connect this operator to the second input. So before we take a look at what that has done to our output, let's also modify our settings, because right now we're blurring the white areas of the image, which means that most of this will end up having some blur applied to it. I'm going to set that back to a value of 1, and then for the black filter width, I'll set that to something like 36. Now, if we then take a look at that in the background, what we should see, maybe if I pause here for a moment, is that our boxes that are a little bit closer to the camera, and also in a lot of cases, the ones that are closer to the camera are kind of earlier along in their lifespan, so they're a little bit more transparent. But regardless, the ones that are closer to the camera have more blur applied to them, and then the ones that are a little bit farther away have either a little or no blur applied, which gives us this real sense of depth and adds a little bit of realism to the output image. So that's looking pretty cool. The next thing that would probably be nice for us to do is to add in some kind of background. So you could put a ramp to do like a kind of gradient or a circular gradient. I think I'm just going to do a constant here because it's fast. So I'll add the constant. First of all, I want to change the operation that it's combining our input texture with the constant to the under operation, and then I'll come back to the constant page, and I'm just going to use black. You could use any color that you like, but that's looking pretty good there. Now we have a background composited in, which really pulls our eye towards the object on the screen instead of the kind of weird alpha matte in the background. Now, another thing that we can do here is to apply either an additional Luma blur or maybe some kind of vignette over top of the image so that the corners of the image have either blur or kind of like a darken vignette effect applied to them, which again will just help to draw the eye towards this center section and add to this illusion of depth that we're generating here. So I think what I'll do in this case is just to approach this via Luma blur, but know that you could do, I'm going to approach this via applying a vignette over top, but know that you could also do this as a Luma blur to blur the edges as well. So for that, I'm going to add another ramp, but I'm going to add it as kind of a second branch of the network. I'll then click and drag from the constant into the input, and then I need to go to the output page here because I don't want to actually composite the output and the input together. I just want to use this input to set my resolution. So this combine with input parameter, I'm going to set to set resolution only. Then I'll come back to the ramp page, and I want to set this to a circular ramp. Finally, I will change my extend right mode to hold. And then we have almost what we're looking for, but we actually want the edges in our case to be black so that we have this kind of vignette effect applied. So that will entail me just flipping the color that is assigned to each one of these color keyframes. So I'm going to click the one on the left first and change that to white. And then I'll click the one on the right and change that to black. And now we have black on the outside, and actually, better yet, we can set the center portion to be transparent to make things a little bit easier for us. So I will go ahead and change the alpha for that middle section to be transparent. And then another thing that I like to do is to set my interpolate notches here to ease in, ease out, which will kind of change the way that that gradient is going from color to color and make it a little bit more smooth. And now let's go ahead and add a composite so that we can start to tweak this a little bit more. So I'm going to add the composite here, then I'm going to connect the vignette or the ramp to it. So if we set our operation here to under, we can end up with this effect overlaid on top of our original texture. And now we can actually tweak that even a little bit more because now it sort of looks like we're looking through a telescope at it instead. So here I might view that in the background and then head back into this ramp here and start tweaking some things. So first of all, I probably don't want the edges here to fade to completely black. So I might also set a slight opacity to those as well. So I can do that via clicking on the right color keyframe and then increasing or rather decreasing the alpha for that particular channel or color rather. So by flipping the bypass on and off, you can see that we're getting somewhere with this vignette effect, but it's adding a sort of washed out gray look to this center area, which I'm going to work on next. So I'm going to add an additional keyframe somewhere in the kind of left third of this gradient. And for this keyframe, I'm going to once again turn the alpha to 0 so that we can ensure that this section is completely transparent and there's no vignetting or effect via this ramp being applied. Then I might come back to this right keyframe and reduce the alpha even a little bit more, just so that it's a little bit more subtle. Now let's see if we can see the difference there. Yeah, so see, that is a much more subtle gradation applied over top of this image than what we had originally. So those are just a couple of suggestions for how you can start to post-process your particle systems so that they look a little bit more polished, a little bit more interesting. Obviously, you can go very far with top-based effects, but as you can see with the kind of the SOP, CHOP, and top-based networks that we used with the instancing itself, there's actually a lot that you can pull from just the particle system and then modify to really dial in specific looks to your particles. So although not an exact replica of Refik Anadol's immersive installations, I hope that this has given you an opportunity to explore how we can start to generate work in that aesthetic style with the built-in operators in TouchDesigner, hopefully giving you a good foundation of how you can work with particles and how you can really pull out a lot of interesting and useful information from the particles themselves to really come up with a unique and stylized result. So with that, we're going to close out this video. Hope that you have enjoyed putting this together. I look forward to seeing you in the next video here on the Interactive and Immersive HQ. Thanks so much for watching.
Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you're serious about taking your TouchDesigner and interactive skills to the next level, I highly recommend you check out the Interactive and Immersive HQ Pro. It's the only educational resource and community of its kind for TouchDesigner and interactive professionals. You can learn more by checking out the link in the description. And if you like this video, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you're new here, don't forget to hit subscribe and the little bell icon for more awesome free content.